heart transplant is now a routine operation. But a number of patients who have received new hearts are reporting huge changes in their tastes, personality, and most extraordinarily, in their memories. They believe that they've been given much more than they bargained for from their donors. The heart has been seen for centuries as a symbolic organ associated with love and emotion. Today, new science is testing this theory, that the heart is involved in our feelings, that it is intelligent and can sometimes lead the brain in our interpretation of the world around us.
From our research, I've come to say that I think the poets and the great scholars have been right all along. The heart plays a particularly unique role in our experience of emotion.
Why have these metaphors dominated for centuries? Is it just metaphor? Is it just poetry? Or is there an inner wisdom here that merits the attention of modern science?
It's a controversial theory, and many cardiologists and neurologists are skeptical.
I'm very skeptical because I know that this organ cannot generate ideas or memory in the sense we know.
Basically, from a surgeon's point of view, the heart is first and foremost, and perhaps last also, a pump.
So is our heart just an organ to pump blood, or could it be much more? The first patient to report a change in personality was Claire Sylvia from Boston in the United States. 20 years ago, she was the first person at New Haven Hospital to receive a heart and lung transplant. The operation was a success.
It was very weird to see my heart on the machine, giving me the beat and hearing it. It was a whole new rhythm, a whole new feeling, and little did I know that my journey was just beginning. It was a couple of days after the surgery that the press came in to interview me, and one of the reporters asked, "Now that you've had this miracle, what do you want more than anything in the world?" And I said, "I'd die for a beer right now." It just came from me, and I'm not a beer drinker, and I was a little mortified by my flippant answer to such a profound question. So that was my first happening, and little by little many things started happening till I was really feeling convinced that I was living with the presence of another within me.
We must travel on land. La, 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 la.
The first thing that happened were the food preference changes. Suddenly, like green peppers, finding them, putting them in my food, I used to take them out. And the first time they allowed me to drive, I found myself going to a Kentucky Fried Chicken place to buy chicken nuggets, something I never did before. I found that my handwriting, instead of going from right to left, it was going from left to right. And these things were sneaking up on me, little by little.
Like most heart transplant recipients, no detail was revealed to Claire about her donor. All she was told was that her heart had come from a young man who had died in a motorcycle accident.
It wasn't until a few months after the transplant that I had a dream in which I'm with a young man. I awakened from the dream feeling that this for certain was my donor. And in the dream, his name, I knew him as Tim L. So I called the transplant coordinator, told her about the dream, and asked her if that was his name. Well, there was a moment of silence, and she said, "Please don't pursue this."
Remarkably, the donor's name was Tim Lamarand. What's more, he loved beer and green peppers. Chicken nuggets were found in his motorcycle jacket when he died. It was only when she finally met her donor family that she pieced everything together, giving her confirmation that everything she was experiencing had extraordinary similarities to her donor.
The family of my heart verified all the experience I was having, and they were hungry to get anything they could from me about Tim that I was remembering from his memories that were coming through me.
Claire was the first case to appear in the public eye. The memories and changes were uncannily like her donor. With strict codes of confidentiality in place at the hospital, it was impossible for Claire to have known these details about her donor. So where could these memories have come from? Professor Paul Pearsall is a cardioneurologist from the University of Honolulu. He first encountered stories like Claire's whilst recovering in hospital from a bone marrow transplant.
I had a bone marrow transplant for stage 4 cancer in the very early 80s. And I was on the transplant unit. And we would sit down at night, all of us who were dying, and most of us were, and talk about things. And the heart transplant recipients were reporting receiving the memories, feelings, food preferences, fears, musical preferences of their donor. One woman who got the heart of a boxer was the most quiet, demure, easygoing woman, hated violence, left the room when her husband would watch football. She's got this heart of the boxer, now she watches football and yells and swears and punches and everything. So that's when I started hearing all these remarkable stories, and I started to collect every single one I could.
Could the transplanted heart be bringing with it some kind of information from its previous owner? We know that the heart is a hugely energetic organ and is in constant communication with the brain. 40,000 neurons, or nerve cells in the heart, communicate up to the brain. Hormones from the heart travel in our bloodstream, and every time the heart beats, it creates a pulse wave. But most impressive of all is our heart's magnetic energy, 5,000 times more powerful than the brain. It can be measured up to 6 feet away from our bodies.
I thought, this heart is just as powerful, more powerful, and does talk to the brain. Maybe we should be paying attention to that. Maybe the brain, even though it thinks it's us, isn't.
Professor Pearsall was sure that the energy of the heart and its relationship with the brain was the key. And as more and more transplant patients came up with these remarkable experiences, it seemed to confirm it. But could his hunch In the last 40 years, we have developed the ability to transplant a heart from one body to another. In that time, intriguing experiences have emerged from recipients who felt their personality had changed after their transplant. It was enough to prompt some scientists to look differently at the heart and test old theories that the heart is involved in our feelings and emotions.
The heart is a connective organ, a gentle organ. It's a different type of intelligence. I don't know all about its intelligence. That's what we need to learn. And how we learn that is by asking openly questions about people's hearts, not dismissing them as poetry, that metaphor. Say, maybe there's something to this.
Professor Pearsall collated his research into a book called The Heart's Code. In it, he explored these stories about organ transplant patients and what they reveal about where we store our memories. Simultaneously, on the opposite side of America, Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry from Yale University, Gary Schwartz, was developing a new theory of how memory could work.
I was studying how feedback mechanisms are involved in learning. When we talk, for example, about how the brain learns, we talk about what are called neural networks in the brain. It turns out that the way a neural network works is that the output of the neurons feed back to the input of the neurons. And this process goes over and over again. And so long as the feedback is present, the neurons will learn. If you cut the feedback, there is no learning in the neurons. And the implication is that it's important for the neurons to have the feedback in order for the learning to take place. Well, by extension, any system that has feedback is going to therefore learn. I mean, we learn to shoot baskets, for example, in basketball by getting feedback about whether we're accurate or not. We learn to speak by getting feedback about whether we're accurate or not. And so consequently, any system, any set of cells that has feedback mechanisms in a network is going to learn the same way that neurons learn. And that's what's called feedback memory or systemic memory.
he applied his theory of feedback memory to the heart and predicted that information could be transferred through organs in transplant surgery. At around the same time, cases like Claire Sylvia hit the headlines. And Professor Pearsall published numerous similar stories from transplant patients. The two men realized their common ground and got in touch with each other.
We spoke to each other on the telephone, and as I began to hear more of details about the cases, I began to realize that this was a theoretical prediction that could actually be verified in the biomedical world. I told Paul that I felt it was very important that some of his best cases be looked at very carefully and that they be published in a journal article.
I collected and did the interviews and did the transcripts and the analysis of the transcripts and had got all the transcripts together and then sent them to Dr. Schwartz.
They had to trace and interview not only the heart recipients, but also the donor families. What they were looking for were parallels between donor and recipient in their preferences, memories, and tastes.
I independently examined those cases, had them blindly looked at by other individuals, and then wrote a formal research report describing those cases and giving the kinds of examples of data that are sort of irrefutable.
Out of the original 70 cases that felt a change, they ended up with 10 whose new personality and memories matched those of their donor.
If you look at the content carefully, you will discover that the degree of coincidence is too detailed. For example, there's a case that we describe of a man 47 years old, and he received the heart of a 17-year-old black young man. And he was not racist, but he had a lot of biases about what he expected of young black men, including the fact that if he was going to pick up anything from them, he would be afraid, for example, that he might be picking up rap music. However, after he received the transplant, of the various changes that he experienced is he had a profound change in his preference for music. He became obsessed with classical music. He began listening to it over and over. He began singing melodies, classical melodies to songs he hadn't heard. His wife was thoroughly confused. Only later was it learned that the young boy was actually leaving his violin lessons because he was a classical violinist and he was hit by a car. That kind of information is not the kind of information that you just get with a random assortment of fears or changes in simple preferences.
The stories they were collecting seemed to contain remarkable parallels. It seemed to Schwartz that the information relayed by the recipient could only have come from their new heart.
To the extent that the heart is serving as a circulating feedback storage system for core central memories in the body, then if that heart is taken out and placed in another body, those core central memories, which are circulating within the heart, in its cellular and neural feedback loops, would continue and be passed on in the new person.
Faced with these new feelings after their transplant, some patients could only look to their donors for an explanation.